So I hope all of you are doing well. So okay lang ba mag-Taglish? Okay lang ba? Or okay? Is it okay? So anyway.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay, Dr. Gia.
It's okay. Thank you. So our title is Mental Health Wellness in the Time of COVID, but just a few disclaimers. No? I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. My specialty is occupational medicine, and I am hospital-based. I have no relevant financial interest or arrangements with other organizations. Just a trigger warning if suicide and self-harm will be mentioned. And of course, this talk does not intend to diagnose mental health conditions. And we have just set some guides and not hard and fast rules. So we start with the current Philippine situation as of May 26, 4 p.m. So currently, we are at these numbers with 14,669 cases already. Next slide. So when we talk about mental health, it's important that we all are in one same page. So when we define mental health, it's a state of well-being. And we would like to highlight on the part that coping is very important in terms of mental health well-being. And coping with what? Coping with the normal stresses of life, just like the pandemic that we are experiencing at the moment. And at the same time, we are able to work productively, and we are also able to contribute our share. That's the most important part for me in his or her community. Next slide. So in this slide, here are a variety of mental health concerns in the time of COVID. Of course, there are still a lot, but based on our experience, these are very common. We're all uncertain about the future. So ano yung mangyayari after May 31? We don't really know what's going to happen, and most especially how the disease will behave. Some of us may have lost a loved one. We all are, or we need to adjust to the changes. This is the new normal, so to speak. So changes means about changes is more of mindset, also mindset, lifestyle, behavior, habits. These all have to change. And of course, we experience heightened emotions during a pandemic. We're extra anxious. We get triggered by news, etc. And of course, one major issue, especially in the healthcare world, and of course to patients with other diseases that are non-COVID related, there is already barriers to access services. Example, kidney dialysis patients, they have difficulty in accessing services, most especially now when it's kind of COVID-centric. But we're already moving out of that, slowly moving out. Next slide. So I'm sure majority of our listeners is on a work from home setup. In fact, work from home is part of the transitioning to the adjustment to the new normal. Because usually, so what happens is on the screen, what happens is our home becomes the new workplace. So when we wake up, may tendency tayo na kailangan magtrabaho ako agad or kailangan maging productive ako agad. Kasi there's this quote-unquote guilt that you're at home, you're comfortable at home, and you have all the time, so to speak. Why? Because there is already, the social cues are already removed. The social cues is you wake up at a certain time, you report to work, time in, you have meetings, lunch break, snack, then you go home. These are all removed on a work from home setup. And so when you tend to overwhelm yourself with being extra productive, you actually, it's actually a potential formula for possible burnout. And so on the lower left of your screen, here are some determining factors that you may want to acquire, just so there is some sort of balance in terms of working from home. So self-awareness is very important. This is when you are aware that you are starting to get anxious, you are starting to get tired of the work that you are doing, and many more, especially the first few slides that I've shown you on the different range of emotions that one may feel. acceptance of the situation is very important because it's already here. Kumbaga, it's parang out of our control. What we can do is make do with what we have. And physical wellness should be established. It's very important that we still move, physical exercise, proper sleep. Let's not forget about that. Because the irony of everything is that we underestimated the hand hygiene so much in the past that ironically, that's the number one prevention against COVID. So parang it just turned around. So let's not forget the basics of health. And of course, going back to what I said, you tend to be burned out. It's very important that you set boundaries within yourself and your coworkers. So parang it pays to have a list on hanggang saan lang yung pwedeng ko gawin ngayon and communicate that. And of course, different people, all of us, work on different paces. So I think setting boundaries within yourself, respecting it, and with others, that's key. That's key in being able to avoid potential burnout from a work from home setup. Next slide. So this is just the biopsychosocial model of health. It just goes to show that it's not all about it's a triad of three. The physical part, that's the biological part, psychological part, and the social aspect. So when COVID hit, it hit the social aspect and of course everything. But just to show you that we cannot be healthy without marrying these three. Next slide. And again, I would like to emphasize that all our feelings are valid and it may vary. So valid and vary. So on this slide are the different types of common feelings. There may be more, but there are different types of feelings and it may vary from person to person. So there is anxiety, social withdrawal. Some have difficulty concentrating, sleeping. Some feel helpless and they're confused. And of course, some have actually lost a loved one because of COVID. Next slide. So there's always this pending question of when do I actually seek help? So we have to remember this paradigm that mental health is a dynamic and it's a balancing act. So below on your screen, the 5Ds are very important. Is it already causing dysfunction? Is it causing distress? Are you starting to deviate already from what you would do normally? Are you a danger to yourself and to others? And of course, the duration matters. Again, I'd like to mention that this is not a diagnostic talk, but in the realm of depression, usually we give 2 weeks of unusual sadness in this in a diagnosis of depression. So next slide. And so I'll turn this over to Dr. Nugget in terms of mental health wellness tips in the time of COVID. RJ?
All right, so good afternoon, everyone. So again, I'm Dr. RJ Nugget. I'm a general practitioner, but mainly my advocacy is on mental health. So I'll be sharing with you some mental wellness tips in the time of COVID. I know everyone is actually having a difficult time right now, one way or another, especially yung ano natin, no, yung environment natin is very uncertain. But of course, in terms of promoting mental wellness tips, of course, I would like to, of course, recognize that it might not work for everyone because as said by Dr. Gia earlier, most of the things that we will be discussing today are generally guides, but not hard and fast rules. Because of course, one intervention that might work for one person might not necessarily work for another person. And there was this webinar that we've attended recently. It's by the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. And they were actually talking about emotional management. And of course, what they're trying to say in that webinar is that most of the things that we actually experience now, even though that they're negative in nature, most of them are actually expected human reactions to a very abnormal situation that we're in. So napaka-importante talaga ng acceptance when we actually talk about mental health because that's the first step towards healing. No? So we have to recognize that the emotions that we actually experience are actually normal reactions to the stressors around us. So if nagmamatch yung emotions that you're experiencing to the intensity that you are experiencing them, then you have to experience that emotion. Because if you would look at this slide, no, so the first graph or the first line in the graph here shows us the feelings of a person just in case that we actually experience them. And as long as we keep on numbing our emotions or avoiding them, then it actually prolongs the emotions that we experience. So, of course, we have to understand that most of the emotions that we will experience are somehow temporary and eventually will fade away. So, in terms of managing our mental health, of course, there are two things that we have to keep in mind. Number one is that we actually increase our capacity to cope, or second, pababain natin yung exposure to stressors. Now, one of the things that we actually advise our patients as well as our friends is to maintain a sense of routine, because routines actually give us some form of self-control in a very uncertain time. So we usually advise them to keep a schedules. For me, I'm a very visual person. That's why I try to write down my schedule. And so that also addresses yung lack of social cues. So if you would recall earlier, Doc Gia actually mentioned that since we're in a work from home setup, the division between work and rest are actually blurred already. That's why having routines can actually regain that sense of control. But of course, we also understand that routines may be boring for some people. That's why we always try to suggest that we integrate some new activities that we can actually employ even if we're at home. Another concept is to understand your triggers. Of course, if you know what's keeping you stressed, then you will be in a better position to address it. And right now, one of the stressors that we actually hear a lot from people is their exposure to media. So when we say media, this is both traditional and social media. And what we always like to say is we have to also shield ourselves from negative news just in case that it's actually getting into us. No, sometimes kasi the news now are actually overwhelming, no, and kumbaga, it overwhelms our capacity to cope. That's why we need to somehow limit the notifications that we receive. Right now, yung mga smartphones natin, we can actually mute some of the conversations, or probably what I also do is that I try to limit my exposure to shows that might be triggering. So I try to listen only to the IATF briefings in the morning, and then in the afternoon, I listen to the DOH briefings para hindi ako constantly na-exposed to negative news. It's also important to expose yourself to factual information because facts minimize fear, no? And of course, I know there are a lot of group chats already, especially sa mga families natin. Sometimes inaccurate information gets shared there. It's important to always fact check and get information from credible sources. Another thing that we also try to apply or advise to our patients is to adopt an attitude of gratitude. Of course, in terms of advocating for gratitude, hindi naman ibig sabihin na to that we don't recognize the negative things that are happening right now. But sometimes it actually pays for your mental health na ibaling yung attention natin to the situation that are actually doing well. No? So you might want to ask yourself, what am I grateful for today? And sometimes yun yung ginagawa ko, especially in the morning when I wake up, I try to list down 3 things that I'm thankful for. And it's actually protective of your mental well-being. Of course, in a time of COVID where physical distancing is actually advised, there are actually a lot of ways to still maintain social connection. That's why most of the activities that are happening now are actually being shifted online. So similar to this activity, we're having webinars. So I know of some people also who are using Zoom or other platforms for group exercises. So probably we just need to be creative in terms of how to utilize these platforms so that we can still maintain a social connection. And of course, it's important also to understand that mental health cannot be separated from our basic necessities. No? So if, for example, if you don't eat well or you don't sleep well, then probably that can also affect our mental well-being. So probably one good suggestion also is, aside from providing emotional support, we also need to be mindful of providing practical help to the people that we're actually working with. So one good way of doing that is to volunteer in doing some errands, especially sa mga elderly population natin, which are actually at higher risk in terms of developing severe forms of the COVID-19 infection. And if you would of course, look at the different theories, like for example, the cognitive behavioral theory, they would actually tell you that the way we actually think about a certain thing actually influences the behavior or our actions. No? So if you, at the bottom part of the screen, you can actually see different approaches in terms of how to approach a certain stressor. So for example, if you can actually control a stressor, then you approach it, no? You address it through action-oriented approaches. But if you cannot control it, so out of your control, or but you can control the thoughts that you have on it, then probably we need to look at emotion-oriented approaches. So dito pumapasok yung reframing certain concepts. Like for example, right now we're in community quarantine. So some would actually look it as a punishment kasi nasa bahay ka lang. But some would actually look at it also as a welcome thing, no? Kasi nga, they can actually use this time to have deeper conversations with your family members. So probably we can actually employ that just in case that we can actually control the negative situation. But of course, if you cannot control it or you can't do anything about it, then that's the time that we apply acceptance-oriented approaches. So later on, I'll be sharing with you some techniques related to acceptance-oriented approaches. So this slide, it's quite technical, but this just tells us that self-care is very important. And in terms of adopting self-care practices, these are actually investments for the long term. But in case that we're actually faced with a very overwhelming situation, then probably it's the time that we actually employ our emergency self-care practices. And here, we're just trying to tell you with this slide that self-care practices are usually deliberate actions, no? Kasi sometimes when we're actually faced with a lot of stressors or very busy tayo when it comes to work, then we actually forget to take care of ourselves. And of course, this slide just tells you the different ways on how to promote self-care. And I know, alam niyo naman yung mga to, these are very basic concepts, but yun nga, sometimes we tend to forget them. That's why kanina I was telling you that this has to be a deliberate effort in terms of integrating these kinds of practices. And at the same time, we also recognize that sometimes hindi pa tayo sanay in terms of doing these things. So like for example, engaging in physical activity. So it might be very commonsensical for you to do that. But for some people, hindi pa sila nag physical activity before. So probably we might need to slowly integrate them in our day-to-day routines also. So I know a lot of people are actually having difficulty in terms of sleeping. So we've actually tried to include this in our slide, which actually talks about sleep hygiene. So what we usually advise is that for people not to have naps in the afternoon or more than 30 minutes, because usually that can affect the quality of sleep at night. We also try to avoid stimulants such as caffeine and nicotine. So when we say caffeine, this includes coffee, tea, and carbonated beverages. Yung mga Coke, yung mga 7-Up, those are actually drinks that actually contain caffeine. And of course, avoid nicotine through cigarettes. So basically, these substances actually stimulate our sympathetic nervous system, which is actually responsible for your alertness. So we also try to promote exercise as a way of improving our sleeping patterns. But of course, take note that exercise should ideally be done in the morning. Kasi usually pag gabi yan, then it might actually stimulate your sympathetic nervous system. And of course, we try to avoid food that might be disruptive at night. So this might mean avoiding foods that are fatty or even spicy food. No? And of course, for those who are in the advanced age group, then probably we need to avoid drinking lots of water before we sleep. Kasi as we age, the capacity of our urinary bladder actually is limited. No? So hindi naman siya yung stretch as much, and it might actually trigger us in waking up kasi we need to urinate. And of course, we also need to ensure exposure to natural light. So this means exposure to sunlight is also very important even if nasa bahay tayo, because exposure to sunlight actually regulates our production of melatonin, which is responsible for our sleep-wake cycle. And of course, before we sleep, probably 1 to 2 hours before our bedtime, then we might need to ensure relaxing environment. So avoid noisy places or try to dim the lights para at least mas conducive siya for sleep. And of course, Diet is also very important. So as you can see in this slide, traditional diets are actually preferred over Western-based diets because usually Western-based diets have high sugar content and high fat content, and it's not actually compatible with good mental health. And again, as I've said earlier, avoid caffeine, sugar, and processed foods. So right now, there are studies already looking at the role of omega-3 fatty acids as an adjunct for depression. So, of course, we might actually be exposed to different coping strategies. And what we're trying to say here is that it might be a process for you to determine what actually works for you. So probably you need to reflect on what coping strategies that worked before and then examine if they're still applicable in this current situation. Now, if they're not working, then probably we need to actually look for other means of coping with the current stressors that we actually experience now. So again, focus on prevention because we don't want to start practicing self-care pag nandoon na tayo sa stage of a diagnosable mental health condition. So even at a day-to-day level or we're just encountering the normal stresses in our day, then probably we need to also complement that with self-care practices. And again, self-care practices are actually slowly integrated dun sa routines natin. So we don't actually goal a very big shift already kasi nga it might actually set us up for failure. And of course, if we're actually encountering a stressful situation, then probably that's the time that we increase our self-care practices. And there are a lot of resources that you can actually take advantage of that are online. And of course, we also need to understand that not everyone is affected the same way. So probably we're actually experiencing the pandemic in a very different manner. Depende kung ano yung mga vulnerabilities mo. Dr. Gia earlier mentioned the different biological and psychological vulnerabilities. That's why we need to probably be mindful that not everyone might be experiencing this pandemic in the same way. So be alert for those who are experiencing isolation, loneliness, or even some form of trauma. And of course, if we're actually faced with a very difficult situation, then probably we need to actually take a pause first, no? Physically distance ourselves and then try to ground ourselves, no? Especially sa mga nakaka-experience ng anxiety disorders. So probably we need to actually practice yung tinatawag nating grounding techniques. So we might probably want to name 5 things that we actually see, name 5 things that we actually hear, because usually when we're experiencing anxiety, this is actually usually a reaction to a future event, no? And sometimes when we actually always think about future events, then nawawala tayo din sa present time. And one way of managing our anxiety is to refocus on the present. That's why we try to utilize our 5 senses and orient them in the present situation. So these are just some exercises that you can actually employ. So some of them are also very basic. So you can do deep breathing exercises, like you inhale for 4 seconds and then hold it in for 1 to 2 seconds and then exhale slowly afterwards. So basically you have to do this slowly and gently, no? So yan yung ina-advise natin. So you can do this for, let's say, 5 to 15 minutes, and this is actually good in terms of releasing some form of anxiety. Another practice is what we call progressive muscle relaxation. So basically, this tells us to isolate a certain part of our body. Like for example, we can select our biceps, for example. So we can flex our biceps for 5 seconds and then slowly relax it afterwards. So that's good in terms of releasing our anxiety. Kasi di ba, when we're overworked, for example, there are certain muscle groups that are aching, especially minsan yung back natin. No? So probably we can also try to do progressive muscle relaxation every 2 hours of working, no? And that is also counted as a break. And of course, mindfulness meditation is also very helpful. There are a lot of free guided meditations that you can actually take advantage of, even on YouTube and other websites. Maraming nag-share ng mga guided meditation practices. And of course, the more you use these techniques, the better they are in terms of our mental well-being. And of course, I think this is somehow the last part of the talk. I'd like to also emphasize on community care, because usually when we talk about mental health, it's usually spoken of in a very personal and individual manner. But we also need to understand that the way the community is structured also affects the actions of the individual. And the actions of one individual can actually influence how mentally healthy a community is. So aside from providing the usual forms of support, probably we also need to look at the different structural changes and social rearrangements that we need to also consider, because even though that there are certain vulnerabilities posed by biological and even psychological factors, most of the triggers that we actually experience come from social factors in nature, no? Especially now in a time of pandemic. And these are just some of the resource materials that you can actually reach out to just in case you need additional support. So you can contact the National Center for Mental Health USAP hotline. It's a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week suicide prevention hotline. And you can also call the this number just in case you need to map out the different services that are open in your area. Kasi I know some people actually went to their provinces right now, no? Kasi naka-work from home naman. You can also click on this link. This is actually a link leading you to the compiled list of free mental health services compiled by the Psychological Association of the Philippines. So, So, yan yung mga different resources that you can actually take advantage of. And lastly, I'd like to emphasize that even though that we're in a state of physical distancing, this does not mean that we should socially isolate. No, it's actually a very important thing ngayon to actually talk about how we actually maintain our relationships, how to deepen them, and how to foster that sense of community, which is actually very important now as we move forward into reopening our society again. So if there are questions, we can actually answer them now.